I was reading this very interesting book called The Transfer of Training, which is written by the Soviet Olympic champion hammer thrower and sports scientist Anatoly Bondarchuk. And in that book he was discussing a concept known as related sports. Apparently, as early as the 20s and the 30s in the Soviet Union, athletes would approach their sport in a very multidisciplinary fashion. They would have their own sport, and depending on the season, they would participate in a related sport. For example, sprinters and jumpers, they would practice skiing in the winter season or maybe ice skating. Throwers, they would take up boxing, and boxers would take up throwing. They would all learn new motorics from different sports that are somewhat related. And some of those athletes would even compete in those related sports. A particularly interesting example was Sergei Liakhov, who was born in 1906, and not only was he a boxing champion but also a national record holder in the throwing events such as shot put, discus throw and hammer throw. And this was a common occurrence during this time. You would have athletes that took up several sports at the same time. Now, if you're a long-time viewer of my channel, you know how much I respect the throwers and their training style. And I believe it is extremely transferable to the sport of boxing when we're talking about the physiological demands, the power development, the hip rotation, the twitch you get from it, the ability to recruit more motor units. All of these things are included in a thrower's training. It is not an exaggeration to say that for your strength and conditioning for boxing, you are better off training sprinting, jumping and the throwing events, like the sports isolated in their own environment, rather than doing what many coaches today would consider physical preparation for boxing. We find ourselves today in quite a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, sports science has definitely grown since the Soviet times, but at the same time, we are also met with much more noise than ever before. It is the job for you as an athlete to also have some basic understanding of sports science, some basic understanding of biology, the Newtonian laws and all of that, so that you can verify what is fact and what is fiction. Another related sport to boxing during this time was actually wrestling. Now you can imagine the physical attributes you develop as a boxer from wrestler training, the bodily manipulation you learn. It probably has tremendous benefits in close combat. The legendary Vasil Lomachenko, who needs no introduction, he used to approach his training in a very multidisciplinary fashion when he was a kid. He did wrestling, he did judo, he took dance classes, he did combat sambo, and all of these sports he later attributed to his boxing success. They gave him a certain motoric, a certain understanding of different unorthodox and alien angles that many boxers would never understand, and at that time he didn't know it, but his father knew it. In MMA, it is not a coincidence that fighters with wrestling backgrounds dominate. Now, I'm not even talking about the physical aspects you get from wrestling. I'm not talking about the endurance, the explosive power, the speed, the mobility. I'm not even talking about the takedowns and the takedown defense. These are missing the forest for the trees. These are symptoms for something much bigger. I am talking about the mental attributes that wrestling gives you. It is not a cliché when they say that once you have wrestled, everything else in life is easy. It is not a coincidence that many wrestlers do well in school. They become scientists, they become engineers, they do startups, they become politicians. Because this is one of very few sports where you have to give so much of your life to the bone and receive so little financial rewards in return. So it filters out the toughest of the competitors that do it for the pure love. You would have to be kind of crazy to get into such a sport. Sometimes just the warm-up of a wrestling session is tougher than anything someone has ever experienced before. Now today there is overwhelming not only scientific evidence but also anecdotes that multi-sport participation is probably superior to early specialization for the vast majority of people. From my own observations, track and field events are especially useful for athletes on a universal basis. They give you a certain twitch and rapidness in all of the actions that you do. You just notice in an athlete if they have been a former sprinter, a former thrower. They just have this ability to recruit motor units much better than the general population. In the Soviet times and in many post-Soviet nations, many boxers, they don't begin until they are, let's say, 12 years old. Before that, they would have to have gone through a large multitude of sports, which usually includes gymnastics and track and field, wrestling and judo. The concept of early specialization is laughable for them. They did many longitudinal studies before, and it showed that the chance of burnout and inferior performance increased dramatically when you specialize too early.